It's time for a chime video. What you just heard was not a NuTone chime. It's a Rittenhouse chime. And it's a Rittenhouse Model 552. And my best guess is it's from somewhere in the mid 1970s. And the Model 552 is referred to or called the Xylophone Chime because of its appearance and design. After having worked on many Rittenhouse chimes over the last 3 or 4 years, this is by far the most standout model that I've ever worked on. It's, I think, a very unique model of chime. The original version, which as near as I can tell probably came out sometime in the late 1950s or really early 1960s, was the Model 550. The 550 was very similar to this design. In fact, they look almost identical. There are some subtle differences, but very, very similar. However, it was different in its mechanism because the 550 had two pieces to the design. It had the xylophone chime portion that you see here, but then it also had this little rectangular metal box called the timer. It's a Model D2 timer, and inside the timer was a motor and a revolving rotor with contacts and a circuit board design. It worked very much like all mechanical chimes do with Telecron motors, but the D2 timer wouldn't be mounted where the chime was. It would be mounted in some faraway place in the house, a closet or the basement or something like that, some out of the way place. That was sort of the hub of the chime, and then there would be wires that ran from the D2 timer to the chime itself and be connected up so it would activate the solenoids. So this Model 552 is a 3-door chime. It's 8 notes for the front door, and then a single note for a side door, and a different single note for the rear door. That's the front door chime, and then the side door chime, just a single note. That was me doing it 3 times. And then the rear door chime, a different single note. And that way you can tell where the visitor is located. Unlike the Model 550, this is a self-contained unit, and if we carefully turn it around, you can see the working parts of it. So what we have here is, this is the heart of the chime. This is the Telecron gear drive motor. And then you have this circuit board underneath. And underneath the motor base, the square black plastic part, is a revolving rotor with contacts on it. And when the motor is activated, it turns the rotor, and the contacts on the rotor make connections on the circuit board. And that's what causes it to ring through the proper sequence. This assembly here is very similar to a Rittenhouse Model C8577 chime. It's sort of a universal chime mechanism that they used in many chimes in the 70s, and it was adapted and used in this Model 552. So that's where the similarities of this chime and any other Rittenhouse chime from the same era end, because this chime has a lot more attention to detail, and I have a feeling that it may be somewhat of a nostalgic throwback for Rittenhouse when they decide to reintroduce a xylophone chime, because it has a lot of unique design features that you don't see in other Rittenhouse chimes from the same period. The way the chime is constructed, they're resonating boxes. There's 4 of them, 1 for each note, here, 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 and here. These are all metal. They're not plastic. And then on the ends, you have these real wood panels to make it very showy. It is a fairly deep chime. It's probably 4.5 or 5 inches deep altogether, so it does extend off the wall quite a bit. You have a volume control adjustment down here, which you can access by reaching up behind the back of the chime to adjust how hard the plungers strike. And then here you have the 4 solenoid assemblies that are energized by the motor assembly, and it's what causes the plungers to strike the chimes. Here in this close-up, you can see what goes inside the solenoid tube. So here we have the spring assembly, and this is a unique spring assembly. This is not like any other Rittenhouse mid-70s spring that I've ever seen, in that it's a single diameter all the way up to here, and then at the very end it becomes smaller. It's tapered. It's a little hard to see, but it's smaller, and the reason that it's smaller is when it's inserted in the solenoid tube, the large end goes in first, and the small end here, where the diameter of the coils is smaller, rests up against the shoulder on the plunger assembly. Now the plunger assembly itself is also unique and not like any other Rittenhouse plunger I've ever seen, in that one, the metal part of the plunger here is much longer than average. It has a wooden tip instead of a plastic tip. And I'm pretty sure that was done because different tip materials produce a different sort of tone when the tone bars are struck. And I have a feeling that back in the late 50s or early 60s, the plunger tips in the 550s would have probably been wood. And I have a feeling that they were sort of recreating a chime from the past, and being true to the design, they went with wooden tips. The other thing that's interesting here is that you'll see this sort of dark colored band here and another one here. And this is actually some sort of cloth or felt material, and it's wrapped around the metal plunger, and the cloth material is actually what slides inside the inside diameter of the solenoid tube, keeping the metal centered but not allowing it to touch. All of the mid-70s Rittenhouse chimes I've ever worked on have plastic solenoid tubes, not metal, and then just a simple metal plunger that slides back and forth inside the plastic. I think plastic was used a lot in those days because it wouldn't oxidize or corrode like a brass tube does, and it made it more trouble-free over time. But this is a much more expensive design than what you commonly see, so I think it's unique to this model. This is the rear cushion, which is also much thicker than average. And then this is the end cap. Now this is not an original end cap. The end cap, which is the piece that goes over the back of the solenoid tube to keep all the parts in place, the original ones were all brass. And in this case of this chime, all of the end caps were split from the stress that pushing them onto the solenoid tubes caused, and they were split enough that they wouldn't stay on over 3 or 4 rings every time the plunger was pushed back into the solenoid board by the spring. It would eventually knock the cap off. So I went with a more modern makeup, which is a plastic cap with a vent hole in the end. This is also typical mid-70s and also used on lots of other types of chimes. So it's a better, more reliable way to do it. So there's a lot of attention to detail here. And I do want to think that this was done this way because it sort of replicated what they did on the original 550s. So it's a very nice, thoughtful design. The bad thing about this is that this is now unique to this model. This isn't shared with any other model. If a customer has one of these and let's say they're missing a plunger assembly or something like that, it will probably be nearly impossible to come up with a replacement part because it really comes down to how many 552s did they make and how many of them are floating around that could be used to rob parts off of. So sometimes unique is not good. Here in this really good close-up, you can see the engraved or stamped Rittenhouse name on the 4th tone bar, which is a nice touch. The tone bars have a really nice satin brass finish. They are brass tone bars. I don't know if they're solid brass or if they're brass plated. I would imagine they're probably some sort of special formula steel because they are tone bars, and then there's a brass wash on them to make them more decorative. And then you have the resonating boxes here, which are all metal, and they're painted in sort of a medium light gold color, which is very nice. One of the other attentions to detail here is you have these sort of conical shaped keepers that hold the tone bars in place, and these actually unscrew. And then the tone bars fit over them. The tone bars do have rubber grommets through the openings of the tone bar, and then on the back of the tone bar there's actually a felt washer right here, and the felt washer again is added on to the tone bar to change the tone of it when the plunger strikes it. This one, the 4th tone bar, the very first time I got this to ring, All of the first three notes all sounded very even and correct, and the fourth note sounded rather clunky. And the reason that it sounded rather clunky was because the felt pad on the back of the tone bar had worn down all the way through back down to the metal from the plunger having hit it, I don't know, 100,000 times. So the tip of the plunger was actually striking the metal and not the felt. So I removed the original one, put a new felt pad in place, and then adjusted it a little bit because it was thicker than the original one until the tone sounded even. Cosmetically, this chime is nearly perfect. The wood panels on the sides are very nice. There's no scratches or gouges. The paint on the resonating boxes is very nice. The tone bars are very good. This little conical keeper right here, this looks like a replacement. It's something I think someone fabricated. One of them must have gotten lost somehow or something like that, but it's very nicely done, and if you don't look too close, you would never know it was a replacement. So this chime was sent in by a fellow named Douglas, and Douglas is in Florida. And Douglas purchased this chime from a seller on eBay. He was, of course, told that it was in good working condition and so on, which really wasn't the case. But the problems with it were kind of ordinary older chime problems. One of the wooden tips on one of the plungers was broken a little bit, and I straightened it out and glued it back, and that's fine now. There was a spring that was missing, so I sourced a spring from another chime and adjusted it to make it work in this chime properly. As for the mechanism, it had the usual mid-70s Rittenhouse mechanism problems, which is two of the contacts on the rotor, there are 4 contacts, 2 of them had worn down to nothing. Some new copper was added and then shaped in the right shape so it would work correctly, and then the circuit board underneath was cleaned so it would make good connections. All of the copper traces on the circuit board are uncoated. It's just bare copper. They do tend to oxidize over time, and that prevents it from making a good connection. So anything that was a connection has been cleaned. The little start-stop switch here began to tear, was folded up, and that was repaired by straightening it and then adding some solder to the crack to hold it together. The other thing which is very common on these chimes are the little screws that thread into the fiberglass board to hold the wires in place had been over tightened too many times, and that strips out the fiberglass so the screw won't tighten down anymore. And when you put a wire under it, that means your wire connection is not solid and secure, so it doesn't work reliably. So what I did was I added some individual little lengths of wire, different colors for each connection, and place them under the screw, snug down the screws as much as I could, and then simply put a little bit of solder on each connection and solder the wire to the copper pad to make it secure and make a good connection. And then when Douglas puts this back up, all he has to do is connect his wires to the ends of my wires, tuck it all back inside, and he'll be good to go. On the bottom of the chime, there are these 2 metal hooks, and the metal hooks are where you place your chime hammer like this, and then when it's on the wall, it's accessible from the bottom of the chime. And I suppose the idea is you can take it off and chime this chime on your own. So there you have it. A Rittenhouse Model 552 xylophone chime that's been brought back into good working condition. I think Doug will be very happy with it. He always wanted a chime like this, and he looked for a really long time, he said, until one finally came along. I hope you found this interesting, and perhaps for someone it will be helpful. If it is, give it a thumbs up on YouTube, because that helps us just a little bit. There'll be a banner right here that shows you how to subscribe. Go to our YouTube homepage, click on the bell, and when you click on the bell, click on it to receive all notifications. And every time we post a new video, you'll get a notification and you can watch it. That's all for today. See you on the next video.